Same space, same 15 crops, same care, and two completely different ways to grow them. On one side, a raised bed filled with a loose, cultivated growing mix. On the other, a traditional in-ground plot prepared directly in the native soil. I wanted to know whether the raised bed would actually produce more food, or whether it would simply look cleaner, feel easier to manage, and cost more to build. And I did not want to answer that by repeating gardening advice. I wanted to compare the crops themselves, watch how each system behaved, and judge the result by the harvest, not by assumptions. This is the kind of question that sounds simple until you try to test it fairly. Raised beds are often praised because they let you control the soil more closely, reduce compaction from foot traffic, improve drainage in many situations, and make planting and weeding easier to reach. In-ground gardens have a different set of strengths. They use the soil you already have, require less structure to build, and depending on the soil and weather, they can hold moisture longer and support deep root systems without a constructed boundary. So before a single seed went in, I had to decide what better would actually mean. For this comparison, better could not mean prettier. It could not mean taller plants during 1 week. It could not mean whichever garden looked more impressive from 10 feet away. I wanted to look at the things that matter when you are trying to grow food. How evenly crops establish, how quickly they begin useful growth, how much weed pressure appears, how the soil handles water, how different crop groups respond, how easy each garden is to maintain, and ultimately how much usable food the space produces. The first rule was to keep the growing area comparable. If one side had more room, more plants, or more sunlight, the result would not tell us much. The second rule was to use the same crop varieties wherever possible, and keep plant spacing as similar as the two systems allowed. The third rule was to give both gardens the same level of attention. That does not mean pretending the soil in a raised bed behaves exactly like native ground. The soil environment is part of what we are testing. It means not giving one side extra fertilizer, extra care, or preferential treatment simply because it starts looking weaker. I also wanted a crop list broad enough to expose differences instead of hiding them. A comparison using only lettuce could tell us something about lettuce, but not much about carrots, beets, cabbage, or herbs. So, this garden included 15 crops with very different habits. Spinach, lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, mustard greens, bok choy, radishes, carrots, beets, turnips, green onions, cilantro, parsley, broccoli, and cabbage. That gives us fast leafy crops, larger leafy crops, root crops, herbs, alliums, and 2 bigger brassicas that demand more space. That mix matters because one growing system may favor a certain type of crop without being universally better. Loose soil can matter a great deal to a carrot trying to develop a straight root. Moisture stability can matter to lettuce trying to stay tender and keep growing. A vigorous cabbage may care about available root volume in a different way than cilantro does. If one garden really has a broad advantage, it should show up across several kinds of plants, not just one lucky crop. Before planting, I paid close attention to the starting condition of each area. The raised bed gave me a defined root zone that was easy to loosen and amend uniformly. The in-ground plot required more attention to the soil that was already there. That is one of the real-world differences between these systems, and hiding it would defeat the purpose. If your native soil is already fertile, friable, and well-drained, the gap between the two methods may be small. If your native soil is compacted, poorly drained, extremely sandy, or difficult to work, the raised bed can change the root environment much more dramatically. That is why I do not think there is a useful universal claim that raised beds are always better, or that in-ground gardening is always more natural, and therefore superior. Gardening is not that simple. What we can do is compare the systems under the same garden conditions and pay attention to where each one gains or loses an advantage. Once both areas were ready, the most important thing was consistency. Rows were laid out with similar spacing. Crops that were direct sown were seeded in comparable ways. Crops started as transplants were placed at similar developmental stages. I did not crowd one garden to make it look fuller, and I did not give the other more room in the hope of increasing individual plant size. The goal was not to create a perfect laboratory. The goal was to create a fair backyard comparison that another home gardener could understand and learn from. Then came the first quiet phase. The stage that rarely looks dramatic on camera, but determines so much of what happens later: establishment. Germination is not only about whether a seed is alive. Soil temperature, surface moisture, seed-to-soil contact, crusting, and how quickly the top layer dries can all affect how evenly a row comes up. With transplanted crops, the comparable question is how quickly roots begin functioning in the new soil, and how evenly plants resume growth. This is also where people often declare a winner much too early. One bed can look ahead because a few seedlings emerge first, but early emergence is not the same thing as final yield. A garden can lead in the first stretch and still lose ground later if moisture becomes harder to manage, weeds become more competitive, roots encounter resistance, or larger crops begin demanding more from the soil. So, I treated early growth as one category, not the final verdict. The fast leafy crops made that especially obvious. Spinach, lettuce, mustard greens, and bok choy give quick visual feedback. When they are comfortable, you see new leaves expanding, rows closing in, and plants beginning to occupy the space. When they are stressed, you may see slower growth, uneven size, or leaves that lose some of their tenderness and vigor. But even here, visual size has to be interpreted carefully. A large plant is useful only if that growth turns into harvestable food. Kale and Swiss chard added a different rhythm. They are not just quick salad crops that are finished in one brief window. They can keep producing leaves over time, which means the growing environment has to support continued root activity and repeated harvest. A system that gives a fast start, but becomes difficult to keep evenly moist, may behave differently over a longer period than it did during establishment. This is one reason a 45-minute comparison can be more useful than a quick before and after clip. The interesting part is not just who starts first, it is who keeps performing. And then there were the root crops. Radishes, carrots, beets, and turnips are almost a separate experiment, hiding inside the larger one. Their leaves can look perfectly respectable, while the part we actually want is developing underground. That makes them valuable because they challenge our tendency to judge a garden by what is easiest to see. A lush carrot top does not guarantee a beautiful carrot. A healthy beet canopy does not tell you everything about the root below. So even before the first real differences appeared, the crop list was already forcing a better question. Instead of asking, which garden looks better, I had to keep asking, which garden is giving each crop what it needs to become useful food? That question would become even more important once water entered the picture. Water is where raised beds and in-ground gardens often begin to feel very different in daily use. A raised bed is elevated, exposed on more sides, and usually filled with a looser mix than the soil around it. That can be a major advantage when drainage is poor, especially after heavy rain. But the same structure can also mean that the root zone loses moisture faster, particularly during warm, windy, or dry weather. In-ground soil is connected to a much larger mass of earth. Depending on its texture and organic matter, that can help buffer moisture changes, although heavy ground can also stay wet too long. The important point is that drains faster and holds water longer are not automatically good or bad. Plants need oxygen around their roots, but they also need a reliable supply of water. The best condition is usually not a soil that stays saturated and not a soil that swings from wet to dry too quickly. It is a root zone that holds enough moisture for steady growth while still allowing air to move through the pore spaces. That is why I paid attention, not only to how each bed looked immediately after watering, but to what happened afterward. Did the surface dry quickly while the root zone stayed adequately moist? Did one garden remain wet long after the other had reached a comfortable level? Did the plants show any sign that the moisture pattern was affecting growth? And perhaps most importantly for a home gardener, how much attention did each system demand to keep conditions reasonably even? This is one of the first places where a raised bed can win one category while losing another. Faster drainage may reduce the risk of water sitting around roots, but it can also increase watering frequency. An in-ground bed may require less frequent irrigation under some conditions, but if the native soil drains poorly, that moisture can become a liability. So I resisted the temptation to award a simple point just because one soil dried first. Instead, I thought about water as a management category. Which garden made it easier to keep the crops in a useful moisture range? Which one gave more margin for error? If I missed the ideal watering time by a little, did one side change faster than the other? These are the questions that matter more than saying one method uses less water without measuring all the variables that influence water use. The crop groups also responded to moisture in different ways. Lettuce and spinach can lose quality when growth is repeatedly interrupted by stress. Young radishes need consistent conditions if you want smooth, fast root development. Carrots are especially vulnerable during germination because their seeds are small and the surface cannot be allowed to dry repeatedly before emergence. Larger established kale, chard, broccoli and cabbage can explore more soil as their roots expand, but they also become heavy users of water as their leaf area increases. This is where the design of the comparison began doing its job. Instead of giving me one dramatic answer, it forced me to see trade-offs. A feature that helped one crop at one stage could be less important to another crop later. And if you are deciding what to build at home, those trade-offs are more useful than a winner chosen from a single photograph. The next category was much easier to see: weeds. Raised beds often begin with a cleaner growing medium and a defined border, which can reduce the number of weed seeds present at the start. They are also easier to reach without stepping into the growing area, so hand weeding can be quick. But no raised bed stays magically weed-free. Wind carries seeds, birds move seeds, compost and mulch can introduce them. And if perennial weeds are already established below or around the structure, they may still become a problem. In-ground gardens begin with whatever weed seed bank and perennial roots are already present in that soil. Preparation can reduce pressure, and mulch can make an enormous difference, but the starting conditions matter. So I looked at weed pressure as another real-world maintenance test, rather than as a claim that one system is always weed-free. What interested me most was not just the number of weeds, it was the competition they created and the time required to keep them from affecting the crops. A few tiny weeds removed in seconds are not the same problem as vigorous weeds growing close to carrots or onions. And a clean-looking bed achieved through constant attention is not necessarily easier to maintain than a slightly weedier bed that takes very little time overall. The useful comparison is workload plus crop impact. This is also where accessibility becomes important. A raised bed can bring the growing surface closer to you. Depending on its height and width, that may make thinning seedlings, harvesting greens, pulling weeds, and inspecting leaves more comfortable. An in-ground bed requires more bending and kneeling, but it can also be expanded easily without buying or building a new frame. Those are not yield measurements, yet they influence whether a garden is sustainable for the person caring for it. By this stage, it would have been easy to focus on maintenance and forget the promise of the experiment. A cleaner bed is nice. A more comfortable bed is nice. A bed that stays evenly moist is valuable. But the question in front of us is still food production. So once the plants were established and the basic management differences were clear, I shifted attention to the crop groups themselves. The leafy greens were the first major battle because there were 6 of them and they occupied the garden in very different ways. Spinach stays relatively low and can be harvested young or allowed to size up. Lettuce can form loose leaves or tighter heads depending on the variety. Mustard greens often grow quickly and can fill space aggressively. Bok choy concentrates a lot of edible material in compact plants. Kale and Swiss chard grow larger and can keep producing leaves through repeated harvests. Rather than asking which bed had the single biggest leaf, I looked for patterns. Was one side more uniform? Were there more harvestable leaves per area? Did the plant stay vigorous between harvests? Did one bed show more stress at the edges or in the center? Did the difference appear across several leafy crops? Or was it really just one species responding strongly? That last question is important because gardeners often overgeneralize from one success. If lettuce loves a particular bed, it does not automatically mean carrots will. If kale grows enormous, that does not prove cilantro will be happier there. The more diverse the crop list, the harder it becomes for one unusual result to dominate the conclusion. Spinach is a good example of why timing and temperature can complicate comparisons. It is a cool season crop, and when conditions become too warm, it can move toward bolting rather than continuing tender leaf production. Lettuce has similar sensitivity to heat, although varieties differ. So if one bed warms sooner or dries faster, that may be an advantage early in cool conditions and a disadvantage later as temperatures rise. A raised bed that warms quickly in spring can help get growth moving, but that same trait is not universally beneficial in every season. Mustard greens and bok choy add another layer because they can grow quickly enough that small differences in soil fertility or moisture show up visibly. Yet fast growth can also make them vulnerable to stress if conditions change abruptly. Again, the goal is not to turn every leaf into a laboratory measurement. It is to observe whether the practical harvest from each side supports the visual impression. Kale and Swiss chard test consistency over a longer span. They can tolerate repeated leaf removal if the plants remain healthy. After a harvest, the question becomes how strongly the plants replace what was taken. That repeated production is often more valuable to a home gardener than one impressive peak. A bed that supports steady regrowth may ultimately provide more usable food, even if it never produces the single largest leaf. This is where I kept returning to the same reminder. Better looking is not the same as better producing. A lush bed may photograph beautifully, but if much of that growth is damaged, bitter, bolting, or otherwise not useful, it should not automatically win. The harvest has to be judged by what you can actually use. The leafy greens also revealed something about spacing. In a rich, loose bed, it is tempting to plant more densely because everything looks capable of growing. But crowding can reduce airflow, increase competition, and make harvest more difficult. In-ground gardens can be crowded too, so keeping comparable density was essential. If one side simply held more plants, total harvest would tell us more about plant count than about growing system. As the leafy crops began to give useful harvests, I still refused to call the overall comparison. The reason was sitting quietly beneath the soil. The root crops were about to test whether the advantages we could see above ground matched what was happening where we could not see it. Root crops are one of the best reasons to compare these systems because the harvest stays hidden until the moment you pull it. Radishes can give an early clue, but carrots, beets, and turnips make you wait longer. Their tops may look healthy, while the roots below are small, forked, misshapen, or beautifully formed. That makes them a useful check against our visual bias. The raised bed begins with an obvious potential advantage if its soil is loose, deep, and free of stones. Carrots, in particular, benefit from a root zone that does not force the main root around hard clods or obstacles. Beets and turnips also appreciate soil that allows roots to expand without severe restriction. But that does not mean a raised bed automatically produces better roots. If the mix is too rich in fresh nitrogen, top growth can become excessive. If moisture fluctuates sharply, root quality can suffer. If the bed is shallow, compacted over time, or allowed to dry too hard, the advantage can disappear. The in-ground plot presents the opposite question. Native soil may contain more variation in texture and density. It may have stones, compacted layers, or heavy clay, or it may already be excellent garden soil after years of compost, mulching, and careful cultivation. That is why recommendations about root crops cannot be separated from actual soil condition. In-ground is not one soil type, just as raised bed is not one soil recipe. Radishes were the first crop I wanted to use as a reality check, because they develop quickly and reveal root zone problems without a long wait. The leaves can tell you the plant is alive and photosynthesizing, but the root tells you whether that growth is translating into the part you plan to eat. When radishes are harvested, I look for usable size, good texture, and a reasonable proportion of root to top. One oversized leaf rosette is not enough to call a success. Carrots raise the standard further. They are slow to germinate, sensitive to surface drying during establishment, and their final shape can reveal physical resistance in the soil. A forked carrot is still edible, so appearance alone should not decide the harvest value. But repeated severe forking or stunting can show that the root zone is making development harder. The most honest comparison is not which carrot looks perfect. It is which system consistently gives more usable carrot from the same space and care. Beets are especially interesting because both the roots and leaves can be useful. That creates a decision about what counts as harvest. If you compare total usable food, beet greens may matter. If the test is specifically root yield, then the roots should be weighed separately. The key is consistency. You cannot count leaves on one side and ignore them on the other. The same harvest rule has to apply to both gardens from beginning to end. Turnips create a similar situation. Depending on the variety and how you use them, both tops and roots can be valuable. They also respond quickly enough to show how root zone conditions influence expansion. A loose raised bed mix may look ideal on paper, but actual results are what matter. A well-prepared in-ground bed can perform extremely well, especially if the native soil has been improved over time. This is the point in the experiment where the early visual leader can lose its psychological advantage. Leafy crops show you almost everything above the surface. Root crops force you to wait. That waiting is useful because it prevents us from treating early beauty as final proof. If the raised bed looked fuller during the first half of the season, the roots might confirm that advantage or challenge it. If the in-ground bed looked slower, the hidden harvest might close the gap. Until the crops come out of the soil, there is no honest way to know. When harvesting root crops for a comparison like this, I would rather be conservative than dramatic. Damaged, rotten, or unusable portions should not be counted as if they were food. At the same time, cosmetically imperfect vegetables that are perfectly edible should not be thrown out just to make the pictures prettier. A home garden is about useful harvest, not supermarket appearance. That principle keeps the comparison grounded in the reason most people grow vegetables in the first place. After the root crops, the green onions, cilantro, and parsley offer a quieter but surprisingly useful part of the test. These plants do not create the same dramatic reveal as pulling a carrot or cutting a cabbage, but they are exactly the kinds of crops that make a small food garden productive in everyday life. A handful of parsley, a bunch of green onions, or repeated cuts of cilantro can matter more in the kitchen than one huge vegetable that arrives all at once. Green onions are useful because their narrow, upright growth makes efficient use of space. They can be planted relatively close together and harvested at different stages. In loose soil, pulling them can be easy. In heavier ground, roots may hold more tightly, but the plants may also benefit from moisture buffering. What I want to know is whether either system gives a meaningful advantage in establishment, thickness, usable tops, and overall uniformity. Cilantro is another crop where season and temperature can overshadow the bed itself. It prefers cooler conditions and can bolt quickly when heat arrives. If one bed warms faster, that may shorten the harvest window under warm conditions even if early growth is excellent. So I would be careful not to blame the growing system for every change in the plant. A good comparison separates what the bed is likely influencing from what weather and crop biology are doing. Parsley is slower and can test patience, especially at germination. Once established, however, it can produce repeated harvests. That makes it a good companion to kale and chard in the longer-term part of the comparison. The first flush of growth matters less than whether the plant stays productive and healthy across repeated cutting. Sometimes, this herb and allium group may show only a small difference between systems. That is not a disappointing result. It can be one of the most useful findings. If a crop performs similarly in both places, then your decision about where to grow it can be based on convenience, available space, rotation, or access, rather than fear that you are sacrificing a large amount of yield. A comparison does not need a dramatic winner in every category to be valuable. By the time the smaller crops have established, and some have already been harvested, The broccoli and cabbage begin to dominate more of the visual space. I think of these as the heavyweight round, because they ask much more from a garden bed. Their roots explore a larger volume of soil, their leaves cast more shade, and they need enough spacing to build substantial heads without turning the whole area into a competition for light and nutrients. Broccoli is not just a question of whether a plant becomes large. The useful payoff is the central head and, depending on how it is managed, later side shoots. A plant can grow an enormous canopy and still disappoint if the edible portion is small or poorly formed. Temperature is also critical. Broccoli is a cool season crop, and heat can affect head quality. That means a warmer raised bed might behave differently from in-ground soil during certain parts of the season, but the direction of that effect depends on the actual weather. Cabbage gives another compact measure of productivity. The outer leaves can be huge, yet the head is what most gardeners are waiting for. A dense, well-formed head represents a lot of food concentrated in a small footprint. But cabbage also needs consistent moisture and nutrition to grow well. Irregular water can create stress, and crowded plants can struggle to size up. So this crop brings several earlier categories together at once: soil structure, moisture management, spacing, and sustained fertility. This is why I like placing broccoli and cabbage near the end of the comparison, instead of treating them as just two more names on a list. By the time they reach useful size, the garden has already experienced watering cycles, weed pressure, repeated harvest from some crops, and seasonal changes. They are testing not only how the system starts, but how it supports a demanding crop over time. At this stage, the scoreboard can become tempting. Maybe one system felt easier to weed. Maybe the other seemed to hold moisture in a way that reduced daily attention. Maybe leafy greens appeared more vigorous on one side while root crops seemed less decisive. But I would still avoid collapsing all those observations into one winner before the harvest is measured. Different gardeners value different categories. Someone with mobility limitations may value bed height more than a small yield difference. Someone in a dry climate may care more about water demand. Someone working with heavy clay may care most about root zone structure. That is also why the final verdict needs two layers. The first is the experimental question: which side produced more usable food under these conditions? The second is the practical question: which system makes the most sense for a particular gardener? Those answers can be different. A raised bed can be the easier system to manage and still fail to justify its extra construction for a gardener with excellent native soil. An in-ground plot can produce very well and still be frustrating for someone who cannot comfortably kneel or bend. A raised bed can solve a drainage problem that makes in-ground gardening unreliable in one yard, while in another yard, the same elevated soil may dry faster than the gardener wants. There is no contradiction in those outcomes. They simply show why better needs a definition. Before the final harvest, I also looked at another factor that is easy to overlook: how much of the bed remained productive through the entire cycle. A garden can have one spectacular crop and several weak ones. Another can be less dramatic but more consistent. For a food garden, consistency across several crops may be more valuable than one standout success. The same is true of harvest timing. If one system gives slightly more food but all at once, while the other gives a steadier flow over several weeks, different households may prefer different patterns. Total weight is useful, but it is not the only measure of usefulness. That said, because the title of this experiment asks which produced more, the scale still has to have the final word on that specific question. And that brings us to the part where photographs and impressions stop being enough. Once harvest begins, every earlier observation has to be translated into usable food. This is where the comparison becomes much harder to argue with, provided the harvest rules are consistent on both sides. For the harvest comparison to mean anything, both sides need the same definition of usable. That sounds obvious, but it is surprisingly easy to change the rules after you see the vegetables. If small but edible leaves are counted on one side, they should be counted on the other. If damaged portions are trimmed away before weighing, the same trimming standard should be applied to both. If a crop is harvested several times, every harvest needs to be recorded. not just the final one that happens to look impressive. Leafy greens are especially important here because they may be cut more than once. A single final harvest can underestimate a bed that has already produced several rounds of lettuce, kale, chard, or mustard greens. Root crops are simpler if they are harvested once. But even there, the edible tops of beets and turnips create a choice. The solution is not to find one perfect universal rule. The solution is to decide the rule before comparing the totals and apply it equally. Broccoli can also complicate the count. If the central head is harvested first and side shoots are collected later, those later harvests are part of the production. Green onions may be pulled whole or cut for tops. Parsley and cilantro may be harvested repeatedly. The more diverse the crop list becomes, the more important record keeping becomes. A fair comparison is built from many small, consistent decisions. This is why I like using both category results and a final total. The category results tell us which types of crops seem to fit each system. The final total answers the simple headline question. If the two totals are close, that is meaningful. It tells us the growing method may matter less than soil quality, crop choice, weather, and management under these conditions. If the difference is large, then the next step is to ask which crop groups created that gap and why. That second question protects us from a misleading conclusion. Imagine one bed produces much more cabbage simply because those two plants had an exceptional season, while most of the other crops are similar. The total would still be real, but we should not pretend every crop favored the same system. Conversely, if several unrelated crops repeatedly perform better in one bed, that pattern deserves more attention. The scale also keeps us honest about visual volume. A basket of lettuce can look enormous because leaves hold a lot of air. A smaller basket of dense carrots, beets, or cabbage may weigh much more. That is why I would never choose the winner by which harvest pile fills the frame more dramatically. The camera is useful for showing quality and abundance. The scale is useful for comparing mass, but even the scale has limits. Weight does not measure flavor, tenderness, nutrient density, convenience, or the value of having herbs available exactly when you need them. It does not measure how much water was used unless water is tracked separately. It does not measure labor unless time is recorded. And it certainly does not measure whether a gardener enjoyed working in one system more than the other. So the scale can answer which produced more by weight, but it cannot answer every question about which garden is better. That distinction is important because raised bed debates often become too absolute. One person has heavy clay that stays wet after every storm and says a raised bed transformed the garden. Another has deep, fertile loam and says building beds would be unnecessary. Both can be right. Their starting soils are different. Their rainfall is different. Their physical needs are different. Their crops may be different. A system is not good in isolation. It is good when it solves the problems you actually have. If your native soil is reasonably fertile, drains well, and can be improved with compost and mulch, an in-ground garden can be extremely productive. It gives roots access to a large soil volume, avoids the cost of filling a structure, and may require less frequent watering in some conditions. It is also easy to expand. You can lengthen a row or create another bed without buying a new container. If your native soil is compacted, poorly drained, contaminated, full of construction debris, or simply difficult to manage, a raised bed may offer a much cleaner starting point. You can bring in a growing mix with better structure, keep foot traffic out of the root zone, and create a defined space that is easier to organize. The bed can also be built at a height that reduces bending. Those benefits may matter even if the final harvest weight is not dramatically higher. For root crops, the decision often begins with soil structure. If you can push a garden fork into your in-ground bed easily, and the soil crumbles rather than forming hard slabs, you may already have an excellent place for carrots, beets, and turnips. If you hit dense clay or stones a few inches down, a deep raised bed filled with suitable soil can remove a major obstacle. The method matters because it changes the root environment, not because wooden or metal walls somehow make vegetables grow faster. For leafy greens, moisture and temperature management may matter more than the presence of a frame. A raised bed can warm sooner when the weather is cool, which may be useful early in the season. It can also dry faster, which means mulching and irrigation become more important. In-ground soil may stay cooler and retain moisture longer, which can be helpful as conditions warm. The exact balance depends on climate, bed construction, soil texture, sun exposure, and wind. Another lesson is that soil improvement can narrow the gap between systems over time. An in-ground bed that begins compacted can become dramatically better after seasons of compost, mulch, cover crops, and reduced foot traffic. A raised bed can also decline if organic matter breaks down, the mix settles, nutrients are not replenished, or the soil becomes compacted from poor handling. Neither system remains perfect without maintenance. This matters when thinking about cost. Raised beds have an obvious upfront investment in the frame and the soil required to fill it. In-ground beds can start with less material, especially if the native soil is already workable. But cost does not stop at construction. Irrigation, compost, mulch, replacement boards or metal, tools, and your own time all matter. Because those numbers vary wildly by location and material choice, I would not pretend there is one universal dollar figure that makes the decision for everyone. Instead, I would ask a more practical question. What problem are you paying to solve? If the answer is poor drainage, inaccessible ground level, contaminated soil, or extremely difficult native soil, a raised bed may be solving a real constraint. If the answer is simply that raised beds look more professional, then a productive in-ground garden may give you everything you need without the extra structure. And then there is accessibility, which deserves more weight than it often receives in yield-focused discussions. If raising the soil surface allows someone to garden comfortably who otherwise could not, that benefit is not a minor footnote. A garden that produces slightly less but can actually be cared for consistently may be far more productive in real life than a theoretically efficient bed that is painful to use. So when people ask me which system is better, I think the most useful answer is another question. Better for what? Better for controlling the soil. Raised beds often have an advantage. Better for low startup cost? In-ground usually has an advantage. Better for reducing bending? A sufficiently tall raised bed has an advantage. Better for conserving moisture? Often in-ground has an advantage, depending on soil and climate. Better for carrots? Whichever bed gives carrots the loose, deep, consistently moist root zone they need. Better for total harvest? That has to be measured in the actual garden. That is the principle I would carry from this 15-crop comparison. The walls of a raised bed do not produce food. Soil, roots, water, light, temperature, nutrients, plant spacing, and management produce food. The bed changes some of those conditions, sometimes in very helpful ways. But if the same favorable conditions can be created in the ground, the performance gap can shrink. This is why I would never use the outcome of one backyard trial to promise that every raised bed will outperform every in-ground garden. A fair experiment can tell us what happened under its own conditions. It can reveal patterns. It can show which factors deserve attention. But applying the result wisely means comparing those conditions to your own yard. If you are standing in your garden trying to decide today, begin with the soil rather than the catalogue of raised bed kits. Dig a hole. Look at the structure. See how water moves through it. Notice whether roots can penetrate deeply. Check whether the area receives adequate sunlight. Think about how comfortably you can reach the plants. Then decide whether a raised structure solves a real problem. If the soil is good, do not assume you are missing out by planting directly in it. Add organic matter where appropriate. Keep walking paths separate from planting areas to reduce compaction. Mulch to suppress weeds and moderate moisture, and build fertility over time. An in-ground bed can become an exceptionally rich growing environment. If the soil is difficult, do not feel obligated to spend years fighting it before you are allowed to build a raised bed. A raised bed can be a practical shortcut to a workable root zone. Just remember that the new soil still needs management. It can settle. It can dry. Nutrients can be depleted. Organic matter can break down. A raised bed is a tool, not a self-maintaining ecosystem. For a small space gardener, I would also think crop by crop. Fast salad greens can fit into edges and succession plantings. Radishes can occupy short windows between larger crops. Green onions can fill narrow strips. Kale and chard can provide repeated harvest. Broccoli and cabbage need more room, so every plant should justify the space it occupies. The system that lets you manage those successions efficiently may increase annual food production, even if one single harvest is not dramatically heavier. The same is true for failures. If a crop fails in both beds because of weather, pests, or planting timing, that tells us something different from a crop failing only in one root environment. If one bed suffers more damage because the plants were stressed, that may matter. But we have to avoid turning correlation into certainty. Gardening happens in an open environment, and not every difference has a single clean cause. That humility actually makes the experiment more useful. Instead of forcing every observation into a story where one bed is the hero and the other is the loser, we can ask what each observation teaches us. Did moisture behavior explain a pattern? Did soil structure show up clearly in root shape? Did the weed workload differ enough to matter? Did accessibility change how consistently the garden was maintained? Those are practical lessons, even when the final totals are close. And when the totals are not close, the same discipline still matters. A large yield difference should send us back through the season to look for the reasons. Was it one crop? Several crop groups? Better establishment? Longer productivity? Less stress? The final number is the headline, but the story behind the number is what helps another gardener make a better decision. So as the last vegetables come out of the soil and the final greens are cut, I do not think of this as raised beds versus old-fashioned gardening. Both methods are old, practical ways of creating a root zone for food. The useful comparison is how well each one matches the site and the person using it. The raised bed gives control. The in-ground bed gives continuity with the existing soil. The raised bed gives defined boundaries. The in-ground bed gives easy expansion. The raised bed can improve accessibility. The in-ground bed avoids filling a structure. The raised bed may drain faster. The in-ground bed may buffer moisture longer. None of those statements alone tells you which one will put more food on your table. Only the complete harvest record can answer that for a specific side-by-side test. And if you do not have that record, the honest answer is not to invent one. It is to use the evidence you do have and keep the conclusion within its limits. That may sound less dramatic than declaring that one method destroys the other, but it is far more useful. Gardening advice becomes dangerous when a local result is presented as a universal rule. The same raised bed that solves waterlogging in one yard can become difficult to keep moist in another. The same native soil that produces beautiful cabbage in one neighborhood can be nearly impossible to work a few miles away. So the final lesson from comparing these 15 crops is not that one structure is magically productive. It is that productivity is the result of matching crop needs to a well-managed root environment. Raised beds and in-ground beds are two different ways to create that environment, and each one can be excellent when it fits the site. If your decision comes down to yield alone, run the comparison honestly. Keep the areas comparable. Grow the same varieties. Record every harvest. Use the same definition of usable food. Track repeated cuts, not just the final basket. Then, let the scale answer the question for your garden. If your decision includes comfort, cost, water, weeds, soil quality, and long-term maintenance, keep those on the scoreboard too. A garden is not successful because it wins one metric. It is successful because it keeps producing food in a way you can realistically maintain. And that is the part I would remember before building anything. Do not choose a raised bed because someone told you raised beds are always superior. Do not reject one because someone told you planting in the ground is more natural. Start with your soil, your climate, your body, your available space, and the crops you actually eat. Then build the system that solves the most important problems with the fewest new ones. Because after all, the spinach, lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, mustard greens, bok choy, radishes, carrots, beets, turnips, green onions, cilantro, parsley, broccoli, and cabbage have been harvested. That is the real payoff. Not proving that one style of gardening deserves to win forever, but understanding why one method may work better in one yard, while the other is the smarter choice somewhere else. The best garden is not simply the one that looks greener in the middle of the season. It is the one that turns your available space, soil, water, time, and effort into a steady supply of food you actually use. Measure that honestly, and the raised bed versus in-ground argument becomes much easier to answer.